Uh, Good evening, sir. At the outset, it is wonderful to be with all of us who are doing this wonderful uh, talk, wonderful technological, excellent thing which has come up. I hope you can see my screen.
No, we can see.
Yes, yeah, we can see you, but not your screen.
Okay, sir. Just a minute.
You have to open your PowerPoint presentation and then go. Yeah, we can see it.
Uh, I hope things are
You
going
can
well.
make it a slideshow.
Yes, sir. Definitely. Uh, is it good
Yeah,
now?
yeah, very good.
Great. Thank you, Sumit sir. Thank you, Dr. Sinu sir. It is wonderful to be with all of you, and I'm humbled by the opportunity given by Trauma 2020 Virtual to me to talk about something which is very interesting. And at the moment, it is catching up. People are actually following the litigations. The challenge is that in trauma care, everything is time, and time is the key. We have been talking about golden hour, platinum minutes, and so on. But when you try to do something by the book, it requires time. And that is where people get unsatisfied, and probably then the litigations start. When you see an ambulance jumping a red light, nobody complains about it. But then if you jump a red light, there'll be people who will be pointing fingers. Once the patient is brought by people to our hospital, uh, everything goes fine. But then most of the attendants, they feel that the doctors and the surgeon attending a trauma victim or an emergency can do miracles. And that is the time when that there is discontent. There is something which is called as unsatisfied customers. But the truth is, the law per se favors the doctors until unless they have committed something very big, something very wrong. So we can talk about the evolution of the law and how it came to be a hurdle in trauma care, or for that matter of fact, medical practices. Or rather, if I would say, uh, the doctors who were seen as gods or demigods started complaining that people are now complaining about our style of working. So if you see, there are two things that are important. There is a hospital, and there are doctors, surgeons, nursing staff, paramedics, medics, technicians. And these are the people who are actually working on the patient. And there is something called as the administration, who is also responsible for the infrastructural things that are there. But then if something goes wrong, the administration thinks then we have to find somebody who can be expendable or who can be pointed fingers at. And that is the time when the litigations come. At the moment, the understanding is the legislation, the medical science, and the administration are three different fields. For the surgeon and the trauma care persons to understand the things comprehensively, they'll have to bring it all three things together and amalgamate a knowledge of legislation, medical sciences, and administrative skills so that the patient is benefited properly. The judiciary system and medical practices, there were civil jurisdiction, civil courts, consumer protection forums, criminal courts, human rights commission, and medical council. And there are so many other things that are being added up now. But then understanding the medical practice in relation to the Indian judiciary is important for all the practitioners at the moment, especially the people who are working in trauma setups. So there are two types of laws, one which are enacted by the parliament, and the others are the case laws, which have got a decision by the Supreme Court and are subsequently followed by the lower courts, and they're binding on them. And most of our all medical practical laws, medical practice related laws actually fall in this category. So the purpose of law would be to protect one and all without bias, and should be universally applicable and binding, but should have a clear-cut guidelines and limitation. When we are talking to certain judges and certain lawyers, leading lawyers, they say that if we talk about the law regarding the medical practices, it is like finding a perfect wife or husband. which is not going to happen anyway. So you'll have to find a path in between and understand the law for what it is. The Indian Medical Council, way back in 60s, they gave us so many things: code of medical ethics, patient care relation, patient physician responsibilities, responsibilities of physician to each other and to the public. They also defined the unethical acts, misconducts, and they also had a sketchy idea about the punishments and the disciplinary action that can be taken against doctors. And that's the time when the courts came in. Uh, there is something called as the mandatory clause, which has now come up very nicely. And the people say that the emergency medical condition to the individual has to be offered in any circumstances or to a victim who is brought to the hospital. Now, this has strengthened the trauma care people. Actually, previously they were a bit skeptical about how to approach a trauma victim. But then this clause coming up from high ups from the court, emergency medical conditions are to be treated without fear, without any doubt. The Indian Penal Code defined two things. One was negligence, and they had certain sections about negligence. Negligence was again divided into a negligent act. There was a word called as voluntarily hurt that actually brought in certain things. Wrongful confinement and negligent act to spread a disease. These words actually came up, which were defined in different various sections. If I am able to give you an example at the moment, a negligent act likely to spread infection of disease to dangerous to life is also listed in one of the sections. So if I take example from today's scenario, if I am seeing a patient without wearing a mask or protective equipment or a PPE, it amounts to be a negligent act on my side, and thus actually putting the patients in danger. So everything is well defined, but then it has to be followed and inculcated by the practices. The new laws, most of the laws were actually pointing fingers to the doctors, but there is a new law which came out in favor of the doctors. And with the incidences rising of misbehavior to medical persons, doctors, paramedic, nurses, the Supreme Court as well as the whole constitutional system actually defined certain other laws in which the attendants of the patient or other people who actually tend to harm the system of the hospital are to be blamed and to be implicated in different under the different sections. Important law that came up was Consumer Protection Act. As per this, the patients were now treated as consumers, which previously was not very much acceptable by the doctors. But this consumerism thing can actually happen in elective procedures, elective patient-doctor interaction. While as per the law, the patients are now new customers or consumers, but in emergency situation, they cannot be actually categorized as consumers and have to be taken care of by the doctors. Landmark cases, there were so many. And one of the cases said, in case of emergency, the doctor has the full right to decide the mode and the type of treatment that the patient requires, but the doctor should also be aware that should not harm the patient in any manner. Another case law which came from the Supreme Court, which defined or rather distinguished between negligence and deficiency in services, and which was very well taken, because if orthopedic trauma case comes to a private hospital and there is no orthopedician, the responsible person who's taking care of the emergency is going to stabilize the patient and then send the patient or refer the patient to a proper facility. While the deficiency in services is not or cannot be termed as negligence, and this is important for all the medical practitioners, especially working in trauma centers, to understand. The case law from 1989 actually came up with a crux that emergency care is a must and should be provided by all the persons or people working in any kind of emergency situation. They should and must actually advocate the basic first aid and try to stabilize the patient rather than shoving their patients out or closing their doors. So therefore, it is important for every medical person to provide emergency this good law, which came as good Samaritan law, is actually most of us are very fond of this. This law had seen light from different medical institutions, especially All India Institute of Medical Sciences, New Delhi, where people, a group of doctors, senior fellows, thought until unless the police reaches a accident site, the patients or people were not rescued. And there were a good number of grilling things that used to happen to people who had brought the patients. So a good idea came up. The Supreme Court took it in a nice manner. And it was realized that the people who actually bring in patients to trauma centers or emergency setups should not be grilled. They have to be respected, and they have done a wonderful duty to be a good citizen, to bring in a person who is actually in need of medical treatment. Consent for surgery again was a debatable topic, and there was a consent thing which has come up, but then the real consent and the informed consent thing was actually elongated along the consent thing. This has to be understood by most of the people, but the consent actually rarely works in cases where there is a time which is of essence, especially in victims of accidents, especially in emergency situations. And then the court and the law also says that the doctor is a good man and he's probably doing the best in the favor of the patient. Therefore, taking consent in emergency situations is probably not binding. But then if we are taking people to ORs, it is good, always good to take consent. The landmark judgment of Markandeya Kajdu and Justice Singhvi ruled out that the courts and the consumer forums are not experts in medical sciences and must not substitute their own views over their specialist. Now, this was realized by the Supreme Court after a lot of consumer things were coming up in the court of law, and court very, very reluctantly, rather very quickly realized that the bridge of consumer and doctor has to be broken. So they were very kind in saying that the doctor and the specialist medical persons should be respected. Their integrity, their decision has to be accepted by most. So therefore, the law should not be intimidating. It should not let the doctor be so afraid to treat the patients that he himself is just filling the paperwork. But it does not happen that way. Doctor is there, or the emergency person is there to actually help the patient, and it has to be respected by the patient, the attendants, as well as the society. The perfect legislation is still to be found, but then how do we protect ourselves from legal issues? Swiss cheese model, every duty should be overlapped. And if something is missed by me, it can be covered by you. Or if you also miss something, it can be covered by somebody else. So a Swiss cheese model actually reduces the chances of making mistakes, or making small petty mistakes, which might actually land you up in court of law. And what we say in medical sciences, do what is written and write what you do. It is a good method to avoid legal issues. In the conclusion, since this is a wonderful conference that has been organized virtually, I took time to devise trauma care laws that can be read as: timing of treatment is most important, replicate what you do, effective domain has to be used. We should have empathy, sympathy with the patient, explain everything to the attendants of the patient. There's not going to be an issue. Use SOPs. SOPs are the standard operating procedures which are there to be used so that people do not land up in court of law. People do not point fingers at doctors. Methodical style of working, affirmative action is always there to protect you. Consent, be advised by the law. If I say that I do not know the law, it does not help me. You'll have to be aware, record whatever you do, empathy to the patients. Every patient is legally liable. Understand this. This is a dictum which has to be understood. Every patient coming to any type of hospital is legally liable. Do all the paperwork, do the best for the patient. Awareness of the law, willingness to do and understand the patient, and following safe practices are going to keep all the trauma care providers at bay from legal issues. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. And again, I thank the Aztec community to have given me this opportunity to be with you all. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you, Dr. Samir. I think you have done terrific homework. You have really covered the topic really well. And the best part is I liked your last slide. Because see, the law issues all come much later. What we face nowadays routinely is volatile tempers and physical violence right at the place of work. And you have really brought it out, the importance of empathy, professionalism, and ethics. And the most important thing is to do the same thing again and again. Don't try to do something different because a new patient has come. That's what our teacher used to say. If you're operating on a VIP, do the same steps of surgery. Don't make it different. So,
True, sir. True.
So I really thank you. And
Professor Sinu, I will just add a word for Samir. Samir, in addition to being a trauma surgeon and a professor of trauma surgery at KGMU, is also a lawyer. And he did his.
Yeah. That's why I said he has done his homework really well.
Yeah, exactly.
Thank you, Samir. Any questions from anybody? We can take 2 questions. Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, it's all clear, sir. Any questions are most welcome.
So I think we can go on to the next talk.
Yeah, next talk, I request Professor Adarsh Kumar to introduce the next speaker, Dr. Chavi Sani.
Sir, thank you, sir, for giving me this opportunity and to be upgraded as panelist instead of a moderator for the question answer session. Thanks, Stack, for including me as a part of the team. Next speaker, our own Professor Chavi Sahni, who is a professor of anesthesiology and intensive care at Trauma Center. And she has got enormous experience with cadaver and live related donor patients. And she is also the nodal officer of the cadaver transplant program at the Trauma Center AIIMS. So I invite Professor Chavi to give her talk. I think she must have sorted out some technical issues were there. I apologize for being late also because I was also having some technical issues.
Chavi, can you share your screen?
There is a problem.
What's the problem? You are not able to share the screen?
Yeah.
Dr. Samir, have you unshared your screen?
Yeah, I unshared the screen.
Okay. Dr. Chavi, you try now. You open your PowerPoint presentation on the desktop and then share screen.
I think Dr. Chavi has gone offline somehow.
Maybe she wants to log in again. We'll just give her 2 minutes.
Yeah, sure.
It was really enlightening to just catch up with Dr. Samir Mishra for the latter part. I missed your initial part, but it was, as Amit has pointed out, that you are a lawyer also. You have done your LLB degree and has got immense experience. And I could see that these are the topics usually shared by the forensic persons. It's always good to note that some surgeon, trauma surgeon, is sharing his views on this particular the aspect.
Sir, actually, I was taught by the best, and 2 of my teachers, Professor Subodh and Professor Amit, I can see them since you were taught by the best, and that is why you actually come up with good things, sir. Thank you for the compliment, sir. Thank you.
And I
Samir,
think
you should come out with a small monogram actually of the very important laws for the residents, which can be included in their blue book, you know.
Yes, true, sir. I'm just
think
going
you
to
can-
try that, sir.
And I think recently the
I
government
suggest,
has changed some this relating to Good Samaritan law.
do we
They
have,
yeah, they have specified also something.
so
Yes,
do we
sir.
have Chavi?
Tani, Chavi is there?
So can I suggest something that we have recorded a video of Dr. T.K. Manoj, and he could not join, but we have a video. So in the meantime, we can play his video, and we can take the opinion of Dr. Pankaj Singh after the video. He is a neurosurgeon himself. So, and then we can take the talk of Dr. Chavi.
Meanwhile, Subodh, tell Chavi to share slides with the host so that
Yeah, okay, I'll do that. I'll do that.
Thank you.
So, can I request Dr. Narendra to share the presentation of Dr. T.K. Manoj?
Sure, sir. I am presenting.
Yeah, please, please.
Is visible, sir?
Yeah, we can see.
Right, sir. May I request Dr. Pankaj Singh, sir, to introduce Dr. T.K. Manoj? Okay, I think sir is somewhere away from the screen. So, Dr.
I will do the needful, Dr. Narendra.
Thank you, sir.
Dr. T.K. Manoj is a neurosurgeon. He works at the St. James Hospital, Chalakudi in Kerala, and he's very much interested not only in the actual management, because he's a neurosurgeon, of head injuries, but also an ardent supporter of the concept of trauma surgery. He is a ATLS course director and also ATLS faculty, and has been doing tremendous amount of teaching within the ATLS paradigm. So Naren, you can start his video. He would be speaking on when to get the neurosurgeon involved. That means what are the indications when a trauma surgeon has to sort of call upon a neurosurgeon.
Narendra, you can start.
Naren, have you optimized the video before sharing on the left side? Because the voice is not coming.
I can't see the video also.
Dr. Naren, are you there?
Yes, sir. I am here only. I will let me check the video again.
So in the meantime, do we have Dr. Chavi? Do we have Dr. Chavi?
Not right.
No. So virtual नहीं पूरा चलाते ना खत्म करते virtual MSc.
Dr. Naren, just optimize the video and you can play it.
Yes, sir. I am just running. Give me 1 minute.
आप फोन पे रहो मैं अभी आपको बोलूंगा तो वो चला देना पूरा वाला
Are you able to hear, sir?
No, we are only seeing your slide. When to get neurosurgeon involved.
Sir?
Increase the volume.
Yes, sir. Actually, sir, slides are not going. It's like this only video. The slide is remain static and the background sound is there.
It will move. Just forward it.
Amit,
Injuries are rather systemic injuries, ranging from a scratch on the scalp to devastating or life-changing brain injuries. We have learned from our experience that time is life in crime. Timely action can save lives and limbs.
You can, Dr. Narendra, you can stop sharing this because I think some problem with the video. Now we will run Dr. Purva's talk. Dr. Chavi is ready? I think no. So we have one more talk. Dr. Purva Mathur is a professor of lab medicine at Trauma Center AIMS, New Delhi. So can we have the video of Dr. Purva Mathur?
Good evening, everyone. So, in today's time, surgeons have to deal not only with the surgeries but also with post-surgical complications like sepsis, antibiotics, and antimicrobial resistant biologics. We know that sepsis is a major growing global burden and a major challenge to intensive care clinicians, researchers, guideline committee members, and policymakers. This is because of the high and increasing incidence and great pathophysiological, molecular, genetic, and clinical complexity of sepsis. Sepsis has high short-term mortality, and there is also growing evidence of long-term morbidity and increased long-term mortality in survivors of sepsis both in developed and developing countries. Further improvement in the care of patients with sepsis will actually impact upon global health in a very, very large manner. So we know that post-operative sepsis, which the surgeons have to deal with, is a leading cause of in-hospital mortality. According to the US CDC, 1 in 25 patients experience at least one healthcare associated infections during the hospitalization period. Patients who are admitted with one or who develop sepsis in hospital have an increased risk of death following hospital discharge. So this is a very important factor that not only during hospitalization but even after the patient is discharged from the hospital, the risk of mortality remains high. Such sepsis associated risk of death is higher than in general population and remains high for up to 5 years following hospital discharge. In one of the last studies, it was found that 43% of severe sepsis survivors were rehospitalized within 90 days, incurring higher costs, especially in the first year after hospital discharge. Because of all these factors, post-operative sepsis has been proposed as a key patient safety indicator, aiming to monitor potentially preventable surgical complications amongst elective surgical patients. This indication was developed after a comprehensive literature review, analysis of ICD-9 CM codes, review by an expert panel, implementation of risk adjustment, and performing empirical analysis. It has been widely used to measure aspects of patient safety and quality and to monitor the impact of quality improvement initiative. So this was one of the largest studies on post-operative sepsis, which was published in 2018, in which more than 144,000 survivors to discharge were followed up. Of these, 1.3% patients had experienced some kind of post-operative sepsis. It was found that their post-discharge mortality rates at day 30, 60, 90, and 1 year were significant patients who did not develop sepsis. Elective surgical patients, post-operative sepsis was independently associated with increased post-discharge mortality up to a year after hospital discharge. This risk was particularly high in the first month in older age patients and in the presence of severe or very severe comorbidities. So these are the high-risk patients who can be targeted for intervention in order to reduce post-operative sepsis. So when we see how important sepsis is in terms of duration of stay, morbidity and mortality, it is very imperative that diagnostics need to be augmented so that early diagnosis of sepsis can be done. So new development in microbiology and biomarkers may shorten the microbiological time to diagnosis and identification of the antimicrobial resistance pattern of the infecting bugs. They should optimize the treatment of infection in critically ill patients also. So recent developments include various molecular techniques using nucleic acid testing and identification by various methods such as ELISA-based hybridization, fluorescence-based real-time detection, liquid or solid phase microarray detection, sequencing, and database recognition. One of the very important innovations in the recent times has been the MALDI-TOF systems, which enable identification of isolated colonies of bacteria and fungi from culture in less than 1 hour. And this has been very usefully and successfully being used in many hospitals to communicate a very rapid report of pathogens which have been identified and isolated in cultures. The other important development have been use of multiplex NAT-based platform for identification of pathogens. So identification of microbes and their resistance can be done now directly from the sample. So it actually reduces by almost 48 hours the time to report to the clinicians, and it helps in early treatment of these patients. So there can be single or multiplex panels for detection of a wide range of respiratory, gastrointestinal and central nervous system pathogens, which can be bacteria, fungal, viral or microbacterial tuberculosis. We have skin and soft tissue panels now, which when directly applied to tissue specimens like bone, muscle, fascia, synovial fluid, they can be used for early diagnosis of a number of pathogens, and the antimicrobial resistance can be ascertained from the sample directly. We also have panels for Mycobacterium tuberculosis and the AMR genes of Mycobacterium tuberculosis, and a couple of diagnostic assays are available for rapid detection of fungal infections which target either the cell walls or the Galactomannan of Aspergillus. And now we also have immunochromatography based lateral flow, which are point of care devices for diagnostic fungal infections. Having said that, in recent times, a lot of emphasis is being given to biomarkers, which are kind of surrogate markers for sepsis, which are kind of very rapid and point of care tests to help in early initiation or de-escalation of antimicrobials. So several biomarker guided antibiotic treatment strategy trials in sepsis have been published, which have been mostly based on PCT. So in the ProRata trials, in which 621 patients were enrolled, a PCT guided treatment strategy decreased the duration of an antibiotic course among ICU patients with suspected bacterial infections. But a firm conclusion could not be reached in that study and in several other studies due to insufficient power of clinically relevant differences in mortality and low adherence to the treatment. It's also very important to discriminate or distinguish whether the patient is having sepsis, is there an infection, is there a severe inflammatory syndrome, or is there a cytokine storm, because all of them present similarly, but the treatment are very different, whether to give anti-inflammatory agents or anti-infective agents or to down-regulate the immune response. So the syndromes for which we use antibiotics are insensitive and often non-specific. This is especially true for VAP, but also occurs in other patient populations where infection is difficult to differentiate from non-infectious inflammation. While PCT may be helpful in limiting the duration of antibiotic therapy, we need a better biomarker of infection in the presence of inflammatory response. So it may not always be infection. And in trauma patients, we did a comprehensive study on the profile of CD4 helper lymphocytes, associated biomarkers, and procalcitonin in the prognostication of severely traumatized patients with sepsis. In this study, we enrolled 50 polytrauma patients with sepsis and 50 controls. And we collected peripheral blood samples at sequential time points to understand the profile of CD4 T helper cells, and various cytokines. Using multicolored flow cytometry, we studied a range of CD4 cells like Th1, Th2, Th9, Th17, Th22, and T regulatory cells, and we also assessed the profile of 14 serum cytokines, which included interferon gamma, TNF alpha, IL-2, 4, 5, 6, 9, 10, 13, 17, 21, 22, and TGF beta. Apart from that, we also estimated the levels of serum procalcitonin, and we ascertained how these cytokines behaved with clinical progression and clinical outcome. We found that of the 50 patients, 25 were microbiologically cured and 40% had a fatal outcome. Majority of these patients were males and developed sepsis almost 12 days post-trauma. The percentages of Th9, T regulatory and Th3 cells were higher in patients than controls, and a very high and persistent serum PCT may be used as an indicator of poor prognosis. By the day of discharge, the level of CD4 T helper cells and the biomarkers were almost comparable to those in healthy control. So we did find that there was a lot of dysregulated immune response in post-trauma patients, which must be also happening post-surgery. So this is in the microbiologically cured polytrauma patients, the T helper lymphocyte profile and the serum cytokine profile in those who were cured compared to those who had a fatal outcome. So we find that there was a lot of difference in several different subtypes of T helper cells and various cytokines, which could be used as prognostic markers in the mid phase, which are the purple blocks, and in the late phase. We also actually did a huge study on surgical site infections in trauma patients, in which a total of 850 patients were enrolled in our SSI surveillance from June 2018 to December 2019. And this was unique in the terms that we did this post-operative surveillance till day 90 after the patient was discharged from the hospital. So of these, 70% patients were male, and patients in the age group of 30 to 49 constituted 36% of enrolled patients. The median stay of all patients was aged 8 days. A total of 47 patients developed surgical site infection, giving the average prevalence as 5.5%. And the median length of stay of patients who developed SSI was significantly higher. 34% of the patients who were diagnosed were detected during the hospital stay, but remarkably 66% were diagnosed during their post-discharge period. So if we do not include that period, we'll miss out a lot of post-surgical infections. 10.6% patient had wound dehiscence, 42% underwent repeat surgery, and 57% needed only wound. So a total of 50 microbes were isolated from these patients. Staph aureus was the most common isolate, and we found a very high level of antimicrobial resistance in these patients. Then what about antibiotics? If infection and sepsis is so important, how about antibiotics? So currently, the best guess empiric therapy is commenced to cover the likely pathogens, including resistance patterns and switching or de-escalating once identification and sensitivities have been obtained. So the balance between benefit and harm of any antibiotic should always be considered. Long courses of antibiotics have no benefit and can predispose to overgrowth of resistant organisms over normal resistant commensal flora. So it's preferable to have culture sensitivity based treatment. Broad spectrum antibiotics we know can cause collateral damage, including overgrowth of potentially pathogenic bowel flora, and the gut microbiome can change permanently within days and cause these bacteria to become resistant. So we know that there are no new classes of antibiotics in the pipeline. However, we have several new combinations of beta-lactam, beta-lactamases like ceftolozane, tazobactam, ceftazidime, avibactam, and ceftaroline, avibactam. We also have a new aminoglycoside, that is plazomicin, which is very good for gram-negative organism. Apart from that, we have novel treatment mechanisms like monoclonal antibodies, peptides, and fast therapies, which are being investigated. But what is to be used is that whatever is available must be used in rational and cautious manner. Some hospitals use inhaled antibiotics for pulmonary infection, which is questionable, but it's a logical approach we tried. How about antibiotics in trauma patients? According to the International Committee of the Red Cross, proper use of antibiotics is to be based on different types of injuries. So for extremity wounds, it is good to use cefazolin, which is a first generation cephalosporin. For thoracic wound, again a first generation cephalosporin. If there is penetrating chest injury with esophageal disruption, metronidazole may be added. In abdominal wound, cefazolin with metronidazole is recommended. For maxillofacial and neck wound, again cefazolin. If there is a CNS wound, you can use first generation cephalosporin, and if there is contamination and abdominal cavity is involved, metronidazole may be added. And for penetrating eye wound, levofloxacin is advisable. So what are the principles of prophylactic antibiotics in trauma, and for that matter any prolonged surgery? The most important is the time of administration. Because the amount of bacteria increases exponentially from the time of trauma, 6 hours appears to be a vital period after wound contamination. We can extend the time of antibiotic treatment if there is an unavoidable delay in administering antibiotics when the wound is open. And first, it has been found that first generation cephalosporins, if not administered within 6 hours in pre-hospital, uncomplicated soft tissue grade 1 wounds, it actually increases the risk of infection. Coming to the choice of antibiotics, immediate treatment with broad spectrum intravenous antibiotics should be given in patients with open fractures or extensive soft tissue loss. High dose IV third generation cephalosporin rather than oral first generation drugs are effective in patients with open fractures. The incidence of wound infections in patients with fresh traumatic wounds or lacerations is low after the administration of coamoxicla, that is augmentin. Cefazolin or vancomycin should be used if the patient cefoxitin or clindamycin and gentamicin. Antibiotics is bound in 24 hours after wound closure. Patients with penetrating abdominal trauma and concomitant thoracolumbar or sacral fractures receiving prophylactic antibiotics for less than 48 hours actually do not develop spinal infection. So there's no need to worry on that. The routes of antibiotic administrations can be either oral, it can be IV infections, and there are several devices applied in complicated soft tissue. So we know about the Surviving Sepsis campaign, and the guidelines keep modifying, but the main focus of these guidelines is identification of the time frame in which antibiotic treatment has to be initiated has been shortened. An hour to initiate as patients of sepsis. So what are the ill effects of overuse of antibiotics? Limiting the time to perform a diagnostic has actually encouraged overuse of antibiotics. So this was a study in Netherlands which showed that up to 43% of patients admitted to ICUs because of sepsis were actually unlikely to even have an infection. Another study showed that 29% of patients who were diagnosed with sepsis and received antibiotics in the ED were unlikely to have an underlying bacterial infection. This unnecessary use of antibiotics can have many negative effects: increased rates of C. difficile infections, organ injury, and a disruption of the gut microbiome. On a population level, overuse of antibiotics can increase antibiotic resistance, leading to a further acceleration of this global crisis. Also, it is able practice all. So is there an evidence for early administration of antibiotics? In 2018, the first and only randomized trial on the subject of early antibiotics for sepsis was conducted. This is the pre-hospital antibiotics against sepsis, which is the FANTASY trial. It evaluated the effects of administration of antibiotics to patients with sepsis in the ambulance rather than in the ED. For this, the emergency medical to recognize patients with sepsis. Patients were randomized to receive either usual supportive care or a dose of 2000 milligrams ceftriaxone in addition to care. The usual group received their first dose of antibiotics in the ED. Resulted in the difference time to antibiotic 96 between the intervention and usual care group. The only difference was the 28-day readmission period, which was in a trial, a short course of prophylactic antibiotic treatment for prevention of post-op infections in clean orthopedic surgeries at our center. We enrolled 197 patients, of which 4 developed surgical site infections, 3 were caused by MRSA and 1 was caused by Acinetobacter baumannii. Of these 4 patients, 2 were in group 1, which was the short course perioperative antimicrobial prophylaxis, and 2 were in group 2, which was the conventional long course treatment. Short course treatment was rupees 150 per patient as compared to 1900 per patient for conventional regimen. We found that there was no significant difference in rates of SSI amongst the 2 groups in our study. Therefore, implementation of a short course perioperative will go a very long way in reducing AMR cost and adverse reaction to antimicrobials. Finally, we can talk any length about antibiotics, but antibiotics are not a panacea for bad practices, and that is why infection.
So now I request Professor Adarsh to invite the next speaker.
I invite Dr. Chavi Sani and request Dr. Narendra to please give the host command to Dr. Chavi, please, who will be our next speaker. Dr. Chavi is a professor of anesthesiology and intensive care at the Trauma Center AIIMS, and she has got enormous experience of working with cadaver and live-related donor patients. And she is in fact the nodal officer of the cadaver transplant program of the Trauma Center. Dr. Chavi Sani, please. Share a screen hoga, I think. Yes, now you can, because Narendra has given you the command.
Ma'am, there is a green box.
Yes.
Narendra, I pressed that. Desktop 1, whiteboard, iPhone. These are the options I'm getting.
Ma'am,
So you have to first open your presentation,
Yes.
Chavi. You have to first open your presentation in the
Yes.
desktop, and then when you will press the green button, you will see your presentation. Then click on your presentation.
Yeah.
The
You will see
presentation
many
is
windows.
open. Dr. Subodh, the presentation is open. I press.
You press the green button,
Green button, share screen.
and then you will see many windows.
Yeah.
So out of all the windows, you see your presentation and click on the presentation.
Actually, there'll be a small icon actually.
Good evening, sir. Sir, I can see desktop 1, whiteboard. Many options are there. I've opened my presentation. I press share screen. Now there are many options. Desktop 1, whiteboard, share.
So have you opened your presentation and minimized, or it's open
My presentation is open.
and it's not visible in the windows?
No, it does not.
Acha, never mind. So I'll request if you can speak without slides on this
Just a
topic.
minute.
Yeah, I think you can very well speak without slides.
All right.
Yeah.
Good evening. I'll be talking about cadaver organ donation in India, the issues and solutions. So if we talk about the timeline of organ donation and transplantation in India, so it was initially that the first organ transplantation was done in 1965. And after that, it was negligible. The organ donation and transplantation rate was negligible. And it was in 1994. Transplantation of Human Organ and Tissue Act was enacted. Yeah. This is, I can see the, yeah, but how to open it? I'm sorry. Amended in 2009 and 2011. And the National Organ Registry was started in 2005, followed by the formation of NOTO, that is National Organ Transplant Tissue, Organ and Tissue Transplant Organization in 2011, after which there was an increase in the organ donation rate. And it increased from 2011 to 2017. There was around 3 times increase. But still it is quite low, as presently the deceased organ donation rate in India is 0.34, which is quite less as compared to the developed countries. Is it visible now?
Yes, it's visible. Please
Now it
continue.
is visible.
Make it a slideshow.
Yes, sir.
On the top, you will have slideshow. Yes.
Yes, just click
Yeah,
on,
just press on the slideshow.
double click.
Just go on to the slideshow.
Yes, sir.
No,
Yeah.
Yes, it will come.
okay. Yeah. Now we can see.
Thank you, sir. So, so I talked about the first kidney transplant in 1961, followed by the Transplantation of Human Organ and Tissues Act. Then the Indian Network for Organ Sharing in 2000, followed by National Organ Registry in 2005. Then NOTO was established in 2011, which acts as an apex body for procurement, allotment, and distribution of organs. And recently in 2019, the National Organ Transplant Program was implemented by the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare. Now, if we look at the transplant scenario, we can see it's very low till about 2011, after which there has been a consistent increase up to 2017, around 3 times increase. But it is quite low, still 0.34 per million population, as compared to Spain, which has a rate of around 35, US 26. Now, this shows us the states which have deceased organ donation activity, and there are just 13 states which are performing these deceased organ donation. And recently, Odisha and Calcutta have started. And Chandigarh is one of the center which is doing these procedures, donation after cardiac death also. Now, this geographic distribution or this mismatch is because of many reasons. It can be because of lack of access to health care system, or the states which have an organ donation system present for a longer time, and then literacy rate. These are some factors which attribute to these difference in the organ donation rate in various states. So this brings us to the challenges. We have some systemic issues, socio-cultural issues, and organizational issues. Now, coming to the systemic or legal issues. Now, actually, brainstem death should be de-linked from organ donation. Brainstem death is identified as a cause of death, as a death, as a type of death only in the Transplant Act, but not in the Registration of Births and Deaths Act. So that becomes an ethical dilemma for the intensivist who is managing the patient. Again, the robustness of tests for brainstem death has been questioned in Kerala High Court. Recently, the test should be videographed, which infringes on the patient's privacy. Again, the donor pledge form, which is quite valid and elaborate, but there is no legal status of the form. The patient's attendants, the relatives have to sign for the organ donation, despite the donor pledge form present. Then the hierarchy for donor consent is also not present, is not defined as of now. So these are some of the issues. Then again, the delay in organ procurement, transport, and handing over the body can also have a negative impact on organ donation and transplantation, because the certain families, we have a time frame in which the burial and the last rites have to be performed. So this acts as a negative influence. Then again, if we come to the organizational support, lack of adequate number of transplant centers in the country with adequate manpower, transplant coordinators, lack of infrastructure, well-equipped ICUs, good dialysis programs, and then standard protocol for donor management are not present in all the setups. And then there can be a conflict of interest among the stakeholders. So these are some of the challenges. But in our center, we have good infrastructure, trained manpower, and we have the donor management protocol in situ. But despite that, if you look at our conversion rates, they are quite less. Maximum up to 12.5, or in 2017, once it was 28%, the conversion rate. So there are other issues also, other than the organizational and systemic issues. These are the socio-cultural factors. And this was a study, there was a study which was performed in All India Institute of Medical Sciences 2016, where they looked at where they studied the attitude of the lay public from North India, and just to study why we are poor organ donors. And it was found that lack of awareness was the single most common cause in 80% patients, followed by religious beliefs, superstitions, and 63% lack of trust in 40%. And literacy rate also plays a very big role. Now, awareness needs to be tackled at all the levels, whether it is community-based awareness, public or patient awareness, hospital-based awareness, where we take care of the patients as well as the healthcare professionals that also need to be the organ donation and transplantation. So various social media can be used for increasing the awareness, but social media has both positive as well as the negative effect. And then again, celebrity endorsement can also be used for improving the awareness. Awareness programs can be conducted at schools, theaters, hospitals. We in our center are conducting weekly awareness programs in our waiting areas, the organ donation and transplant purpose. Then theaters, street plays, again involvement of relievers. The transplant coordination counseling is required to increase the organ donation rate in our center. Now, this was a study performed in which the authors studied the strategies to improve the donation, and it was found that if the patient is aware and familiar with the organ donation and transplant activities, it has a positive correlation with the attitude parameters. Now, where we can intervene include the health education, improvement in doctor-patient relationship, and conducive legal legislative measures. Now, health education, we can educate the children who can further talk to their family members, who can further impart education. Second, we can also educate the healthcare professionals like the transplant coordinators, the doctors. Only then they will be able to allay the fears or apprehensions of the patients. This can be performed only by well-informed healthcare providers. And then again, we can use the eminent persons in the society like the imams and the Muslims, who can educate or who can inform the other members of the society. And this would improve the doctor-patient relationship or counseling, or better, such as conducive legislature can help where there is a lack of support in the family for legal transplantation or donation. And now all this we can do by conducting various workshops, CMEs, and moreover, it can also be included in the curriculum, because many healthcare professionals and even our graduates are unaware about this process, about the organ donation, transplant programs, and it has already been included in the undergraduate curriculum in 2018. Then another fact, and the brain death declaration has been made mandatory, and discussion about organ donation has been included in end-of-life care. Then training of transplant coordinator and intensivist is being carried out by conducting various workshops, CMEs regularly by NOTO and other organizations as well. Even Orbo that we have at AIIMS are conducting these workshops. Then infrastructure and organizational support. So green corridors, which are required for the transport of the organs, are being these days we have a lot of green transports, green corridors prepared. These are the special road routes. Quickly the street signals are changed manually, and then the traffic is diverted. And this was initially done in Chennai, but now this is done regularly to improve the transportation of the organs. Then further, we need to have greater transparency. We need to take steps to prevent and control organ trading. Now, organ donation and transplant is a byproduct of good trauma and intensive care. So we need to identify the potential donors from the very beginning. We need to widen the donor spectrum by using expanded donor criteria. A higher age group can be taken with comorbidities, but that means better brain donor management of the geriatric population. Now, last but not the least is the opt-out system instead of opt-in system, which is a very controversial system. Actually, in India, we have the opt-in system. That is, you have to give a consent. We have a very high donation rate. We have an opt unless and until the donor gives it in writing. So that is a controversy, whether this system is suited for our country, where we have a high illiteracy rate. Now, recently, regarding COVID-19 and organ transplantation, we have to assess the risk-benefit ratio. Unless and until we find that the patient cannot wait or he'll die for lack of transplant, we should avoid surgery as far as possible. And detailed assessment of epidemiology, current trends, surge capacity, impact of COVID-19, as well as the availability of infrastructure should be looked into before going ahead with transplant in this scenario. And then safety of healthcare workers, prevention of transmission of infection from patient to healthcare workers, as well as PPE, universal precaution to account. Prevention of cross-infection from transplant patient to other patients. So it is going to be a slow process, and we have to do it in incremental ways. Thank you.